At 8:12 a.m., Evelyn Carter was sitting at her desk, staring at an email that changed everything. It wasn't long. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even rude. It simply said, "Your role will be reassessed during the restructuring process." No explanation. No meeting invite. No human voice behind it. Just a sentence. At 8:14 a.m., her manager walked past her desk without making eye contact. At 8:17 a.m., the Slack channel called Leadership Alignment removed her access. At 8:21 a.m., Evelyn realized something terrifying. She wasn't being fired. She was being slowly erased. And the most dangerous part? Everyone around her was pretending nothing was happening. Evelyn Carter had been with the company for 6 years. She wasn't loud. She wasn't charming. She wasn't the type to dominate meetings. But every system that worked, she touched it. Every process that ran smoothly, she designed it. At 7:30 a.m. every weekday, she arrived before most of the office lights were on. Not to impress anyone. Not to compete. She arrived early because she liked order. And order was something this company pretended to value. Until it became inconvenient. Evelyn wasn't part of the executive circle. She didn't play golf with the VP of operations. She didn't drink after work with the product director. She believed in something naive. That competence was enough. By year 5, she had quietly become the person everyone depended on. And no one defended. When systems broke, they called Evelyn. When audits came, they forwarded them to Evelyn. When something went wrong, they needed a name that wasn't theirs. And Evelyn gave them one. Hers. At 2:46 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, she was pulled into a meeting she hadn't been prepared for. No agenda. No documents. Just faces that had already made a decision. Her manager spoke calmly. Too calmly. "This isn't personal, it's strategic." That was the moment Evelyn understood something critical. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as infrastructure. And infrastructure is invisible. Until it collapses. At 9:03 a.m., the calendar invite finally appeared. Subject line. Org restructure alignment. No agenda. No context. No note. Just a list of names that made Evelyn's stomach tighten. Wesley Rains, Co-O. Tara Vance, Head of Product. Miles Donovan, Finance Director. And her manager, Caleb Shore, sitting right in the middle, like he belonged there. Evelyn didn't. But they invited her anyway. That was the first sign this wasn't a meeting. It was a performance. At 9:11 a.m., she walked into the glass conference room. Seattle rain tapped softly against the windows, like someone trying to warn her. Nobody looked up when she entered. Not the kind of busy that meant they were working. The kind of busy that meant they were avoiding guilt. Caleb finally offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Evelyn," he said, like her name was a formality. Wesley Rains started speaking without greeting. "We're streamlining," he said. "Tightening accountability. Removing redundancy." Tara nodded, as if she'd rehearsed the nod in a mirror. Miles had a laptop open, but he wasn't taking notes. He already had them. Evelyn listened, quiet, hands folded in front of her, as if she was there to learn. But her mind was already doing the math. Because restructuring was the word companies used when they wanted to do something dirty. And call it progress. Wesley clicked to the next slide. A bright, clean chart appeared. Boxes. Lines. Titles. Her title was still there. But it was thinner. A smaller box now. Pushed down. And next to it, a new box had appeared. Systems Optimization Lead. No name under it. Just a vacancy shaped like a weapon. Wesley spoke again. "This role will absorb process management, compliance tracking, vendor coordination, audit response." Evelyn didn't blink. Those weren't job duties. Those were her life. He was describing what she already did. But he was describing it like it belonged to someone else. Caleb leaned forward, hands clasped. "This is an opportunity," he said, with a soft voice meant to sound supportive. Evelyn knew that voice. That voice was used when someone wanted to give you bad news. While pretending they were helping you. She asked her first question. Calm. Measured. "Who created the new structure?" Wesley didn't answer. Tara did. "Leadership collaborated." A vague answer. The kind of answer that meant, "You're not important enough to know." Evelyn nodded once. Then asked her second question. Why was I removed from leadership alignment access at 8:17 a.m.? Silence. A sharp one. Like a blade placed gently on the table. Caleb's smile cracked. Just slightly. That may have been automated, he said. Automated? That word again. The company loved to hide behind systems. If no human did it. No human was responsible. Evelyn turned her eyes to Miles. The finance director. The man who never spoke unless he had numbers to protect him. Miles, she said. Does this restructuring come with layoffs? Miles looked up, like he had to remember how to be a person. He gave a careful half answer. We're rebalancing headcount. Evelyn almost smiled. Rebalancing. So yes. At 9:27 a.m., Wesley clicked to a slide titled Risk Management. Under it, bullet points. Compliance exposure. Audit delays. Vendor reliance. Process bottlenecks. Then Wesley spoke the sentence that made the whole room colder. We've identified key risk points, he said. And we have to reduce dependency on single individuals. Single individuals. Evelyn felt the insult land. Because what he meant was, you're a risk. Not because she was unreliable. Because she was too essential. They didn't want to lose her work. They wanted to lose her power. Caleb cleared his throat. Evelyn, he began. We need you to document your processes. Evelyn stared at him, then asked, softly, How long do I have? Caleb's eyes flicked to Wesley. Wesley answered, 2 weeks. 2 weeks. To write down everything she knew. To turn her mind into a manual. To make herself replaceable. At 9:41 a.m., the meeting ended with smiles that felt like plastic. Caleb stood up like he wanted to escort her out. Like a gentleman. Like a good man. But his hand hovered near her back, without touching. A fake courtesy. Evelyn walked out alone. At 9:44 a.m., she returned to her desk. At 9:46 a.m., an email arrived from Caleb. Subject line, Knowledge Transfer Plan. And under it, a spreadsheet. Tabs, deadlines, checkboxes. A timeline for her own disappearance. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't slam her keyboard. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she did something that surprised even her. She opened a new document. Blank. White. At the top, she typed a title. Not for them. For herself. What they don't know they gave me. Because in that meeting, they thought they were taking control. But they had made one mistake. They had told Evelyn the exact date they planned to erase her. And once you know the date someone plans to bury you, you have time to dig a tunnel. At 10:02 a.m., Evelyn stood up, walked to the restroom, and locked herself in a stall. That's where the first tear finally came. One tear, then another. Not because she was weak, because she was human, and because betrayal doesn't need shouting to hurt. It hurts most when it's delivered politely. When it comes with corporate words. When it comes with a smile. At 10:07 a.m., Evelyn washed her face, looked into the mirror, and whispered 2 words nobody heard. Okay, fine. Then, she returned to her desk. At 10:11 a.m., she started doing exactly what they asked. Documenting. But not the way they expected. Because Evelyn wasn't just writing processes. She was writing a story. A story with a beginning. And an ending they couldn't see. At 6:38 a.m., Evelyn Carter was already awake. Not because she was anxious, because she was alert. Betrayal had a way of sharpening the mind. At 7:21 a.m., she arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was quiet. The elevators empty. The kind of quiet where systems felt exposed. She unlocked her laptop, opened the spreadsheet Caleb had sent, and stared at the first tab. Core processes. That word again. Core. As if the company had one. Evelyn smiled faintly. Because she knew the truth. There wasn't one core. There were dozens. And most of them ran through her. At 7:30 a.m., she began documenting. Not everything. Just enough. She wrote clean sentences. Clear steps. Professional tone. But she noticed something important. The spreadsheet didn't ask why anything worked. Only how. And how was fragile. How broke easily. Why survived chaos. At 8:02 a.m., she moved to the next tab. Vendor dependencies. She paused. Because this wasn't a list. It was a pressure map. Each vendor had a story. A late payment once. A contract amended quietly. A compliance exception approved over coffee. Things that never went into writing. Things that lived only in conversations. And memory. Her memory. Evelyn documented names. But not leverage. At 8:41 a.m., Slack notifications began to appear. People she hadn't heard from in months. Quick question. Do you remember how this works? Can you hop on a call later? She answered politely. Briefly. She never refused. She simply delayed. At 9:18 a.m., Caleb stopped by her desk. He leaned casually against the partition, like this was just another morning. Doing okay? He asked. Evelyn nodded. Of course. He glanced at her screen. The spreadsheet. Rows filling up. Progress bars turning green. Relief flickered across his face. That's when she realized something dangerous. They weren't watching closely anymore. They thought the threat was neutralized. Caleb smiled. Leadership really appreciates your cooperation, he said. Cooperation. A word people used when they benefited from your silence. At 9:31 a.m., he walked away. Evelyn exhaled slowly. Then she opened a second document. Hidden. Encrypted. She titled it. Single Points of Failure. This one wasn't about processes. It was about people. Wesley Rains. The COO who approved shortcuts without understanding them. Tara Vance. The product head who promised timelines she couldn't deliver. Miles Donovan. Finance director. Clean hands. Dirty assumptions. Evelyn didn't write accusations. She wrote facts. Dates. Times. Dependencies. At 11:06 a.m., she noticed something subtle. A recurring approval. Same timestamp pattern. Same executive initials. Always just before audit deadlines. Always routed through her systems. They had used her structure to hide their haste. And now, they wanted to remove her from it. At 12:14 p.m., Evelyn ate lunch alone at her desk. She didn't scroll. She didn't text. She reviewed logs. Old ones. The kind nobody checked anymore. At 1:37 p.m., she found it. A configuration change. Small. Unremarkable. But undocumented. Approved verbally. Never signed. Never audited. A compliance risk so quiet it blended into routine. She leaned back in her chair. Not smiling. Not angry. Just aware. At 2:22 p.m., Tara sent her a message. Can you send me the finalized process docs by end of week? Evelyn replied within seconds. Absolutely. At 3:09 p.m., she updated the spreadsheet again. More green bars. More checkmarks. More illusion. By 4:48 p.m., the office buzzed with end-of-day exhaustion. Evelyn packed her bag slowly. Deliberately. As she shut down her laptop, she looked around. This place had never been her enemy. People were. And people always left fingerprints. They thought they were removing a dependency. What they were really doing was removing the only person who knew how to keep their secrets aligned. At 5:06 p.m., Evelyn stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, she whispered something to herself. Not a threat. Not a promise. A decision. They want documentation, she said quietly. I'll give them documentation, just not the kind that saves them. At 8:09 a.m., the email didn't go to Evelyn. That was the first sign something was wrong. It went to leadership alignment, the same channel she had been quietly removed from. Subject line. Notice of external compliance review. No emojis. No pleasantries. Just a formal notice. An audit. Unscheduled. Unrequested. Unavoidable. At 8:14 a.m., the office tone shifted. People stopped chatting. Footsteps sped up. Doors closed softly. But not fully. That kind of silence always meant fear. Evelyn found out 3 minutes later. At 8:07 a.m., Caleb appeared beside her desk. He didn't lean this time. He stood straight. Rigid. Can you step into conference room B? He asked. His voice was steady. Too steady. At 8:21 a.m., Evelyn sat across from the same faces as before. But something had changed. Wesley's confidence had thinned. Tara's hands were folded tighter than usual. Miles wasn't looking at his laptop. He was looking at her. We've been notified of a compliance audit, Wesley said. Evelyn nodded once. Neutral. When does it start? She asked. Wesley hesitated. At 9 a.m. Less than 40 minutes. No prep. No buffer. That wasn't standard. That was surgical. Tara spoke next. They're asking for documentation, she said. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Which documentation? Tara swallowed. Process logs, approval trails, vendor exceptions. Everything. Everything Evelyn had touched. Caleb leaned forward. You're the best person to help us through this, he said. Us. That word felt heavy. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She checked the time. 8:29 a.m. Then she spoke. I'll support the audit, she said calmly. A collective exhale rippled through the room. But, she continued, I'll need written authorization to represent the company. The exhale stopped. Miles frowned. That's unusual. Evelyn met his eyes. So is an unannounced audit. Silence again. Wesley nodded reluctantly. Fine, he said. We'll draft something. At 8:41 a.m., Evelyn returned to her desk. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She opened her encrypted document. Single points of failure. She reviewed the timestamps. The undocumented approval. The recurring initials. At 8:56 a.m., her inbox chimed. Subject line. Temporary Audit Authority. Attached. A PDF. Signed. At 9 a.m., the auditors arrived. 2 of them. External. Neutral expressions. Sharp eyes. They introduced themselves. Evelyn shook their hands. Professional. Composed. At 9:07 a.m., the first request came in. Can we see approval records for vendor compliance exceptions over the last 18 months? Wesley looked at Evelyn. Like a child looking at a parent. Evelyn nodded. Of course. She pulled up the logs. The official ones. Clean. Then the auditor asked a follow-up. And are there any verbal approvals not reflected here? The room froze. At 9:11 a.m., Evelyn answered truthfully. There are instances where approvals were given verbally, she said. Wesley stiffened. Tara's eyes widened. Miles stopped breathing. The auditor nodded. Can you identify who provided those approvals? Evelyn paused. Just long enough. Not for drama. For accuracy. Yes, she said. At 9:18 a.m. She listed the names. Not emotionally. Not accusatory. Just facts. The room didn't explode. It shrank. The auditors took notes. Wesley cleared his throat. These were time-sensitive decisions, he said quickly. The auditor didn't look up. We'll determine that. At 9:34 a.m. Another request. Can we see system access changelogs related to leadership channels? Evelyn clicked. At 9:36 a.m., the screen showed it. A timestamp. 8:17 a.m. Her removal. No justification field completed. No ticket number. Just an action. An action without documentation. The auditor leaned closer. Who authorized this? Caleb opened his mouth. Then closed it. At Neo. 4:08 a.m., Evelyn answered. It was initiated by my manager, she said. Caleb's face drained of color. I wasn't asked why, Evelyn added. No reason was recorded. The auditors exchanged a glance. At 9:52 a.m., the questions kept coming. Each one precise. Each one. Tightening the room. Evelyn answered everything. Exactly. She didn't volunteer opinions. She didn't defend anyone. She simply stopped protecting them. By 10:28 a.m., Wesley asked for a break. The auditors agreed. As they stepped out, Wesley turned to Evelyn. His voice was lower now. Urgent. Why didn't you tell us about these risks earlier? Evelyn looked at him. Calm. I did, she said. You just didn't document it. At 10:31 a.m., Wesley said nothing, because there was nothing to say. At 10:44 a.m., the auditors returned. And this time, they weren't smiling. At 11:02 a.m., the audit resumed. But the tone had changed. The auditors weren't gathering information anymore. They were confirming conclusions. At 11:06 a.m., the first request landed. Please provide written justification for all verbal approvals related to vendor compliance exceptions. Wesley opened his mouth. then closed it. Because justification required documentation, and documentation required accountability. At 11:13 a.m., Tara tried to speak. These decisions were made under pressure, she said. We were moving fast. The auditor finally looked up. Pressure does not remove responsibility. The sentence landed like a verdict. At 11:27 a.m., the auditors asked for internal escalation records. Evelyn pulled them up. Emails, meeting notes, calendar invites, patterns. Every concern she had raised had been acknowledged verbally and ignored formally. At 11:41 a.m., the auditors asked a question nobody expected. Who designed the current process architecture? The room went quiet. Wesley glanced at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. Evelyn answered, I did. The auditor nodded slowly. And who approved deviations from that architecture? Evelyn didn't hesitate. Leadership. At 11:52 a.m., the auditors stopped addressing Wesley. They stopped addressing Tara. They addressed Evelyn. Directly. Were you instructed to bypass documentation standards? Yes, Evelyn said. By whom? She named names. Still calm. Still factual. At 12:09 p.m., lunch came and went untouched. No one was hungry. Fear had its own metabolism. At 12:34 p.m., Miles finally tried to regain control. This feels disproportionate, he said. The auditor responded without emotion. Risk compounds quietly. At 12:48 p.m., the system access logs came up again. This time, not just Evelyn's removal. Other changes. Quiet ones. Channels restricted. Oversight reduced. All within a narrow window. The same window as the restructuring. At 1:02 p.m., the auditors stopped asking Evelyn questions. They started thanking her. For clarity. For cooperation. For accuracy. Words she hadn't heard internally in years. At 1:18 p.m., Wesley asked to speak privately. The auditors declined. This review remains transparent, one of them said. That word. Transparent. The thing the company claimed to value, but never practiced. At 1:37 p.m., the auditors issued their preliminary finding. Not written. Spoken. There are material compliance risks associated with undocumented executive decisions. Material. That word meant consequences. At 1:44 p.m., HR was looped in. At 1:51 p.m., legal joined the call. At 2:03 p.m., the room was no longer a conference room. It was a courtroom without a judge. At 2:17 p.m., Caleb finally looked at Evelyn. Really looked. Not as infrastructure. Not as a tool. As a person, he had underestimated. I didn't know it was this bad, he said quietly. Evelyn met his eyes. I did, she replied. At 2:31 p.m., the auditors stood up. We'll deliver our full report within 10 business days, they said. But until then, we recommend immediate role review for involved parties. Involved parties. Plural. At 2:36 p.m., Wesley's phone buzzed. Then Tara's. Then Caleb's. Calendar updates. Closed-door meetings. Emergency sessions. Evelyn received nothing. And for the first time, that felt like freedom. At 2:49 p.m., she returned to her desk. The spreadsheet was still open. The green bars still there. She completed the final checkbox. Knowledge transfer. Complete. At 3:02 p.m., she emailed it to Caleb. Short message. Let me know if you need anything else. She knew they wouldn't. Because what they needed was already gone. At 3:18 p.m., Evelyn shut down her laptop. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She stood up, looked once at the office floor, and realized something quietly powerful. They hadn't removed a dependency. They had removed their last layer of protection. At 3:27 p.m., she walked out. No applause. No confrontation. Just a system beginning to correct itself. At 8:04 a.m. the next morning, Evelyn Carter didn't go straight to her desk. She stopped by HR. No anger. No drama. Just a folder in her hand. Inside, it was a resignation letter. Short. Clean. Professional. Effective immediately. At 8:07 a.m., the HR manager blinked twice. You're resigning? She asked. Evelyn nodded. Yes. But the audit. I'm no longer required, Evelyn said gently. The sentence landed heavier than it sounded. At 8:14 a.m., legal requested a meeting. At 8:22 a.m., they asked if she was willing to stay on temporarily. Consulting. Transition support. Damage control disguised as opportunity. Evelyn listened, then declined. I've already transferred everything you asked for, she said. Everything. At 8:37 a.m., her badge access was revoked. This time, documented. This time, approved. This time, too late. At 8:51 a.m., Evelyn returned to her desk for the last time. She packed slowly. One notebook. One mug. One framed photo she'd kept turned face down. No farewell emails. No announcement. At 9:06 a.m., Caleb appeared. He looked smaller. Not defeated. Just exposed. I didn't think you'd leave, he said. Evelyn sipped her bag. That's the problem, she replied. At 9:11 a.m., he tried once more. You know the system better than anyone. Evelyn looked at him. Calm. I built it to survive without me, she said. Then she added, softer. I just didn't build it to protect people who ignored it. At 9:19 a.m., she walked toward the elevators. Behind her, the office buzzed. Phones ringing. Meetings forming. Questions without answers. At 9:24 a.m., the elevator doors closed. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt light. 2 weeks later, at 10:41 a.m., the audit report circulated. Not publicly, but thoroughly. Findings. Recommendations. Immediate actions. At 11:08 a.m., Wesley Rains was placed on administrative leave. At 11:22 a.m., Tara Vance stepped down to pursue other opportunities. At 11:47 a.m., Caleb's team was restructured, without him at the center. At 12:16 p.m., the company issued a statement about renewed commitment to compliance. The stock dipped, then stabilized. The system corrected itself, just like Evelyn knew it would. 3 months later, at 7:52 a.m., Evelyn walked into a different building. Smaller. Quieter. She wasn't early. She wasn't late. She was on time. Her title was different now. Independent Systems Consultant. Her first client? A company preparing for an audit. They didn't ask her to move fast. They asked her to do it right. At 4:18 p.m., as she shut down her laptop, she checked her phone. A notification. LinkedIn. A message request. From Caleb? She didn't open it. She didn't need closure. She already had clarity. At 4:23 p.m., Evelyn stepped outside. The city moved around her. Unaware. Indifferent. Fair. She had learned something essential. Revenge doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like leaving. With your integrity intact. And your silence louder than any accusation.